Hello again, gamers. Welcome back to the Board Game Captain. I'm the Captain, and today I'm going to be counting down my top 10 favorite games from the 1980s. Before I get started, though, I want to draw attention to the fact that I am wearing one of our merch shirts. This is the I Drink and I Game, It's What I Do shirt. If you'd like to get yourself some cool gamer gear, shirts like this and others, as well as mugs, they are all available over on our Teespring store. There's a link in the description down below. In addition, if you are in a position to and would like to help out the channel, there is also a link to our Patreon in the description down below. Joining can give you the ability to get some access to behind the scenes information, as well as early access to some videos, and even the ability to request review and tutorial videos to your favorite classic games. All right, so without any further ado, we're going to jump into it. So now, I spent my formative years in the 1980s, and I did play some of these games in the 80s. A lot of them, actually, though, I discovered later in the 90s. But these are, of all the games that I had played that were designed from 1980 to 1989 that I have played, these are going to be my top 10 favorites. Now, before I get into it, I do want to give one honorable mention. This one's kind of funny. I don't really consider this one to be like a board game, but it was on Board Game Geek when I was going through all the games from the 1980s. And it was if it is a game, it was a game that I played a lot of, so I want to throw it on as an honorable mention. And that is the Muscle Hard Rockin' Ring. Now, this was from the Muscle / Ultimate Muscle / Muscle Men toy line. They had a ring where you had joysticks and you played it kind of like a dexterity game. You and your opponent each chose a wrestler. You shoved it into the claw arm. It just held on by the tension of the claw itself. And then you would knock them into each other and try to be the first to knock your opponent's Muscle Man figure out of the claw, and that would mean you had won. Now, I had one of these, and I had a lot of the muscle figures back in the 80s, and me and my brother used to play the crap out of it. Now, I was really surprised to find this on Board Game Geek that it had an entry. So, since it did, even though I don't really consider it a board game, I decided to give it an honorable mention. So, without any further ado, let's get to my number 10. Number 10. My number 10 favorite game from the 1980s is one that I still have a copy of and have mentioned numerous times before on this channel, and that is Lone Wolf and Cub. Now, as a kid, I was obsessed with old Japanese samurai films. I used to have a local station where I grew up that had Samurai Saturdays, and I would watch marathons of samurai movies. Most of the time, I wouldn't even know the names of the movies. I just enjoyed watching them. I loved the drama and the action and the sword fighting. So when I saw this game sometime late 80s, early 90s time period on the shelf, I was immediately like, I want to check out this game. You get to be a samurai. And of course, it's based on the existing IP from the movies of Lone Wolf and Cub. And in it, it was actually, I think, the first really storyline adventure game rather than just a dungeon crawler that I had ever played. First one that had, storyline sequences that after you had defeated an encounter or succeeded at a trial, that you would have a storyline bit to read. And you could play this 2-player, but there was almost no interaction. There was the possibility to have a duel if you ran into each other, but usually that didn't happen. And even if it did, it would be very short. Generally speaking, you each went off and tried to do your own quest to get your own points, that if you got a certain number of 2 different kinds of points, you would win. But this game was a lot of fun. The combat system was a very interesting card-based combat system. And I always really enjoyed this one, and that is why it is my number 10, Lone Wolf and Cub. Number 9. My number 9 game is one that I unfortunately do not have my copy of anymore, though they have reprinted it, and I think I would like to see if I can find one of the newer reprints if I could. I don't know if it's in print right now, but I know there was a more modern reprint, and it's gone by a lot of names, but the name I had it under was Samurai Swords. Now, it was later reprinted as Shogun, and then again as more recently as Ikusa. But this was a really cool area control game. It really felt to me like this is the sort of game you could graduate onto when you got totally bored with Risk back in the day. So the thing was, you're trying to conquer Japan, but so unlike Risk, you actually had different types of units, and the different units had different levels of initiative, and they had different strength, which higher strength meant they had a better chance of causing damage when they attacked. And there were a lot of kinds of units. You had samurais, and you had archers, and you had riflemen, and you had pikemen, and all different things. And also, this was one of the first games I'd ever played that let you do a little bit of what we now would refer to as programming with hidden information. You set your coins behind a screen to decide if you were putting money into buying new troops or trying to hire the ninja, which was really cool because you could use the ninja either to steal information from one of your opponents or to try to assassinate their leader. That was a really fun part of the game. One of the other fun parts that I really liked, which I've heard is actually not in the more recent reprint, which my question is why, is they used to have these swords with different numbers of diamonds on them, and they were for figuring out who was going like second, third, or fourth, because I think you could put money in, if I remember correctly, to be the first player, but then everybody else would get random on where they went. It was like drawing straws, but they looked like katanas, and those were really, really cool. Samurai Swords was a really awesome game. It was fairly advanced. One of the more advanced games for me at the time when I was playing it. It was one of those ones that would go on and be a multi-hour affair, but it was tons of fun, and actually I do wish I still had a copy of Samurai Swords in my collection. Number 8. My number 8 game is a game that I actually never played in the 80s or the 90s or even the 2000s. I actually discovered it fairly recently, within the last couple of years. And that is Abalone. Now, this was an abstract game from the 80s, and I always saw it on shelves, but I never picked it up, and I never tried it out. And then there was a couple of years ago, Lynn bought it for me as one of my holiday gifts. And I was like, wow, I've always seen this game. I've always wanted to try it. And then I tried it, and it was one of those moments of, why did I not play this 20 years ago or 30 years ago? It was a lot of fun. It's a really great abstract game where you can shove around each other's pieces, and the pieces are all marbles, which is really awesome. I love that they did it that way. And you're trying to shove your opponent's marbles off the board, but you have to have more of your marbles to shove your less of your opponent's marbles. So a lot of it's positioning and protecting yourself by lining up more marbles, because you only move 3 marbles at a time. So you have to have like 2 or 1 of your opponent's marbles, while you have 3 of yours to shove those 2, or 2 of yours to shove that 1 and try to get it off the board. But as you're shoving, your opponent might come at you from a different angle and break up your line of marbles. This is a great game. Really fantastic abstract strategy game. Thoroughly stands up to today because I play it now. And that is why Abalone is my number 8 favorite game from the 1980s. Number 7. My number 7 game from the 1980s is one I discovered in the 90s, but it was designed in the 80s. This is Titan. Now, Titan is a very interesting designed game, and a lot of the mechanics are very cool and do hold up. The only issue I have with it in modern play is that there can be player elimination. But if you play to 2 players, then you don't have to worry about that. But the thing is, it feels like a couple of different games in one. You've got the game of moving around on the board and recruiting units, which is actually my absolute favorite part of this game, because what it is you move your armies around and they're hidden, but when you land on a space, there'll be a recruitment tree that you can see on the side of the board that says, well, if you have 2 of this monster, you can get 1 of this monster, or if you have 3 of this monster, you can get 1 of that monster. And if you have the more advanced monster, you can always use it to get 1 of the same, or get a lesser monster if you choose. And so you move around and you try to get more and more powerful monsters into your armies, but your armies can't go above a certain size. Then they have to break up into 2 separate ones. And then there's which guys do I put in which? I have to make sure I have guys that can recruit in multiple spaces wherever they go, because the different types of terrain have different creatures that you can recruit. And then when you run into opponents' armies, you have this little mini battle game that you pull off to the side. Another reason why I really only like this one at 2 players, because at 3 players, if 2 people are having the battle, the third player is off over there going, when's my turn? But at 2 players, it's great. You move around the board, then you run into each other, then you have the battle, and you fight it out till only 1 force remains. And if you can ever find and defeat your opponent's Titan, they lose. They're out. That's it. This game was a lot of fun. This is another one, though, that could go on for a really long time. But this is one where me and my brother would play it, and we would actually avoid fighting each other just because we loved trying to get the more powerful monsters, and we just wanted to recruit bigger and better and more awesome monsters. And it was always really hard to get to like the center ring of the board. And when you went in, you could only recruit once, and then you had to go back out, and like the most powerful monsters in the game were in there. So you wanted to build up so you could possibly go in and recruit some of them, and that was really awesome. And that is why my number 7 favorite game from the 1980s is Titan. Number 6. My number 6 game from the 1980s is the very first dungeon crawl or RPG-like game that I ever played, and it was a lot of people's first for that, and it was Hero Quest. So Hero Quest was part of the partnership that was being done between Milton Bradley and Games Workshop, where Milton Bradley was producing some board games based on the Games Workshop Warhammer Fantasy and also later, I think it might have done some with the Warhammer 40k universe as well. But this one was based on the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and it was made to be like a light role-playing game, a dungeon crawler game in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. You each took the control of a single hero, and you would go on different adventures and go through the dungeon. One person did have to be the game master to control the monsters and the bad guys. They didn't have AI decks back in the 80s. That's a much more modern advent. But this game was a lot of fun, and it came with a bunch of little plastic miniatures for the monsters. The biggest bad guy was the gargoyle, and he looked so cool. He was like, had his arms out, and the big whip and everything. And they had little cardboard doors and everything, and little chests. It was really well done for its time. Really cool game. A lot of fun. I do not still have my copy of this, though I know they have become quite a collector's item. I have heard that someone is working on doing a new edition of it. I hope they do away with the roll and move aspect. That was one of the few gripes I would have about it in modern play. But you know what? For back in the 1980s, Hero Quest was awesome, and it was a really, really good and really fun dungeon crawler, and that's why it is my number 6 favorite game from the 1980s. Number 5. My number 5 game from the 1980s is another one that I only really discovered much more recently. Never played it back in the 80s or even the 90s. And this one is Merchant of Venus. Now, a while back, Fantasy Flight had the rights, and they did a reprint, though they did both the original version on one side of the board and a new upgraded modernized version on the other. Now, here's the thing. Both versions are awesome. I do think the upgraded version that they did is better, but actually the old version was still really good. It was still a lot of fun. And even though they improved it for the new modern version, I can see why people adored this game back in the 1980s. Because playing the old version, I was like, yeah, for the games back then, for the way games were back then, this game was fantastic. So Merchant of Venus, if you're not familiar, is a pick up and deliver game with a whole economy in the game. You fly around and you pick up cargo and you pick up passengers, and you have to deliver them to planets to get paid and make money. And basically you want to be the most successful delivery rocket ship crew in the galaxy. And it's a lot of fun. It's really cool. It's a very low aggro game. It's very much about the economics and not about like fighting or anything like that. And it's got a really cool, fun, tongue-in-cheek sci-fi theme to it with a lot of very funny cargoes. One of my favorites being the impossible furniture, which is so bizarre. But yeah, that is why Merchant of Venus is my number 5 favorite game of the 1980s. Number 4. My number 4 favorite game from the 1980s is another one that was based on Games Workshop's IP of Warhammer Fantasy. And this is one that is it still gets reprinted periodically and has a lot of people have a lot of fond memories of it. It's not done as just dungeon crawler though. This one is Talisman, and this is a game where you roll and you move around the board. But it was one of the earliest games I ever played that had asymmetrical player powers, which that was like really cool because you got to pick who you wanted to be. Did you want to be the Goblin Fanatic, or did you want to be like the Human Warrior? You picked what character you wanted to be, and they had different special abilities, which was really cool. And it helped in their movement or in their fighting of monsters or whatever it might be. And this game was a lot of fun. I remember you had to do the outer ring before you could get strong enough to move into the inner ring, before you could fight the big boss. Talisman's a lot of fun. There are some issues with it in the modern day, especially with the roll and move mechanic. A lot of people are not a huge fan of it. But this is one I still have a copy of in my collection. Actually, I believe I have two different copies of it. I think I have an older edition and a more modern edition in my collection. And this is one that actually, if I did have the right group of people around, I would definitely pull out and play now. I have a whole lot of nostalgia for Talisman. I think it's a fantastic game, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And that is why it is my number 4 favorite game of the 1980s. Number 3. My number 3 favorite game of the 1980s is one I got, I think, either as one of my holiday gifts or one of my birthday gifts in like 3rd grade, something like that. I remember that I did get it as a present, and this is a game that I don't know if I would have rated it this high back then, because back then I might have rated a lot of games higher that aren't even on this list. But this is a game that just has really stood the test of time. It comes out again and again and again, and consistently over the years is a game that I can play with anyone, and everyone always has a thoroughly good time playing it. I actually eventually had to retire my old copy because the timer wasn't working anymore. I'm talking about categories. So I bought a new edition of it that had even more cards in it with more categories. Categories is great. So here's the thing. If you're not familiar, Categories has a timer, and it has, everybody gets a little booklet with, you have a pad, and you have a bunch of categories. You agree what list you're using. Say, we're using list 2. And you put list 2 in. It has categories in things like things in this room, or names of capitals, or weapons, or something like that. And then you roll the die that has all the letters on it, and you have to pick an answer to each of the categories that start with the letter that was rolled. And you do it 3 times, 3 different letters for all the categories in the amount of time given to you by the timer. And then at the end, whoever has the most points, 1 point per correct answer, wins the game of Categories. This is one of those that, again, not only does it still hit the table, but when it does hit the table, this is one of those games that will hit the table repeatedly in a row. We'll play 2 or 3 games of it. It never comes out for 1 game. It comes out for 2 or 3 games minimum. And that's why Categories has gone all the way up to my number 3 favorite game from the decade of the 1980s, just because of its staying power and the fact that it still never gets played less than twice anytime I pull it out. Number 2. My number 2 game of the 1980s is a game that, even though the original edition was made in 79, the edition I'm going to be referencing was made in the 80s, and it is a game that I did not discover until much more recently playing it at conventions, but now I really love it. It's really cool, and I wish I could get my hands on a copy of it, but unfortunately it's long out of print, though I have found a game that's a spiritual successor to it, and I'll reference that later. But that is Starfleet Battles, the Commander's Edition. Now, the Commander's Edition came out in the 80s, I believe it was 83, and it was like an all-in-one box that had everything you needed to play. And this allowed you to play out battles between ships in the Star Trek universe. So you could be a Klingon bird of prey. You could be a Federation starship. You could be a Romulan warbird. You could even be ships from the Gorn and the Kazin, which I love. I love that they have Kazinti ships in there, because the Kazin are only in the Star Trek universe thanks to a single episode of the Star Trek animated series that Larry Niven wrote and decided to throw them in, because otherwise the Kazin are from Larry Niven's Known Space universe, which includes the Ring World Series and the Fleet of World Series. So I love that they're in there. My favorite races to be are the Gorn and the Kazin. I love being the more obscure races because everyone always wants to be Klingons or Romulans, but I love being Gorn and Kazin. And I love the Gorn have those plasma torpedoes like the Romulans do, though not quite the same ones. They were a little different. But those things are powerful, very powerful. Really fun game, hex map. The initiative system was a bit complicated, and their way of keeping track of it did leave a little something to be desired. Usually played very well if you had a game master actually running the game to keep track of the initiative system for you. Otherwise, it did tend to have a little bit of slowdown for it. But that brings me to, there's an interesting newer game called Talisman, which I feel is like a spiritual successor to this. It has a very similar initiative system, but with a better component for keeping track of the initiative system. It makes it much easier to keep track of without having a game master. I might actually try using the Talons component in it if I ever do get myself a copy of it, and that is Starfleet Battles, the amazingly awesome Commander's Edition, which was a great way to simulate battles from the Star Trek universe, and that is why it is my #2 favorite game from the 1980s.
And now it is time for #1.
Okay, so my #1 favorite game from the 1980s is one that even when I have trouble finding people to play with, I am always obsessed with, always creating units for. It's Battletech. I love Battletech. I still play Battletech. I need to have the right opponents to play Battletech because it is the kind of game that, since some of it is rather advanced and others of it is rather dated, there are some people who turn their nose up at it. But I still get an immense amount of enjoyment playing Battletech. You know what? If you like playing a game that everyone else turns their nose up at, except for you and one or two of your friends, never let them tell you it's wrong to play that game. If you get enjoyment out of it, you have fun playing that game. And that's me with Battletech, because I have a lot of friends that won't touch it, but I love it, and I have some friends that will play it with me. But even when I'm not getting to play it, I'm always designing mechs for it. I love the ability to actually design your own battle mechs. Battletech, if you're not familiar, is a big hex-based map system where you usually do about 4 mechs on 4 mechs and have a big fight, and you have to keep track of heat of the weapons and damage you do to what areas. It's all roll to hit and then roll to see where you hit, and the weapon tells you how much damage it did and how much heat, and you also have to keep track of weapons that have ammunition, how much ammo you use. Usually ammunition-based weapons don't cause as much heat, but then they have limited ammo, whereas energy weapons don't have limited ammo, but they will cause more heat, so things like lasers and particle projector cannons. And Battletech is absolutely tons of fun. I have never had a bad time playing it. Really cool game. One of my absolute favorite war strategy games, and also my absolute favorite game from the 1980s. So there you go. What did you guys think? If you have any of your favorite games that I missed on the list that you'd like to tell me about, let me know about your favorite games from the 1980s in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this top 10 list and you'd like to see me do more top 10 lists, I'm thinking about doing some for maybe each of the years in the 90s and maybe the 2000s as well. If you want to see those, be sure to give this video a like, share it on all forms of social media, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Board Game Captain. That's Captain spelled with a K on YouTube. And until next time, game on.